Some crimes take a long time to solve, and it's only when advances in technology and investigative techniques can be used that the culprits are finally tracked down. In 2025, certain crimes that could not be solved years ago were finally reviewed, and as a result, those responsible were forced to face the consequences of their actions. Number 10. For 58 years, a man named Ryland Headley got away with a heinous crime that he committed in Bristol, England in 1967, and he must have thought that he'd gotten away with it until his arrest that took place in June of 2025. On the 28th of June that year, 75-year-old Louisa Dunn was living alone in Easton since her husband had passed away, which made her an easy target for anyone with nefarious purposes, such as Headley. On that day, he entered her home, brutally assaulted her, and then ended her life via strangulation before fleeing. Later that day, one of Louisa's neighbors went looking for her at home, and when she entered, she was shocked by what she found. Louisa was found lying on the living room floor, and her neighbor immediately contacted the police, but by the time that they arrived, she'd passed away. It was immediately apparent that whoever had committed the crime had no regard for the lives of others. Her family has revealed that when people found out about the crime, they were outraged, since Louisa was a harmless woman who couldn't possibly have defended herself against such a vicious attack. Evidence was collected from the crime scene, but with no witnesses and very few usable leads, investigators were stumped. They were able to confirm that Louisa's attacker had broken into her house, so it was almost certain that she didn't know the culprit. Luckily, that evidence has been preserved by the police, and in 2023, they decided to revisit the case using modern investigative techniques like DNA testing. One of the pieces of evidence that had been retained was a skirt that Louisa was wearing when the attack took place, and it was swabbed for DNA. Headley's luck had finally run out more than half a century after he committed the crime, as the DNA found on Louisa's clothing came back as a 1,000,000,000-to-1 match, and there was no doubt in anyone's minds that he was the attacker. It was then discovered that he'd already spent some time in prison, as he'd attacked 2 other women in October of 1977. His modus operandi was the same in those cases, as he'd broken into the homes of 2 elderly women in the dead of night before attacking them. A partial handprint that was recovered from Louisa's house was then compared to Headley's by 4 fingerprint experts, and once again it came back as a match. The print was found on a window at the back of her house, likely at the spot where he managed to gain entry. Since it was known that Headley was a repeat offender, his fate was sealed. He was taken into custody despite his pleas of innocence, and at trial, the other 2 women who were attacked testified, telling the court of the ordeals that they'd lived through, and that confirmed once again that Headley was the one responsible. At his sentencing, Headley was described by the judge as worse than an animal, and he proceeded to sentence him to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years, which, considering that he's now 92 years old, means that he'll never walk free. Number 9. The reinvestigation into a case from 2023 began in October of 2024, and in September of 2025, a suspect was finally arrested, and it involved the murder of 30-year-old Rosa Argeo, who was living in Colorado at the time. Rosa had a difficult time growing up for the first 5 years of her life, as she was diagnosed with meningitis that left her unable to speak. It was only after her 5th birthday that she was able to start communicating orally, according to her mother, Arizona Winters. But as an adult, her life didn't get much easier. Her family says that she struggled to find regular work, and at times she had to resort to sleeping on the streets. When she did manage to find some work, she was only paid minimum wage, and she struggled to get by. To make matters worse, she had an extremely trusting nature, and hence would often find herself being taken advantage of by the wrong types of people. When she did find someone willing to put her up, it was usually only for a short while, and she would then have to start all over again. Her mother would go through long periods without speaking to Rosa, since she had no way of contacting her while she was living on the streets, and on many occasions, she became extremely concerned for her safety, as she had no idea where she was or who she was spending time with. Rosa ended up having 3 children, all of whom were given up for adoption, since she had no way of caring for them, But through all of this, Rosa remained a caring and trusting person who loved children, making the fact that she had to give her own up for adoption even more tragic. On several occasions, Arizona helped Rosa find work as a cleaner, but those jobs were always temporary. Her life was made all the more complicated by a string of bad relationships, the most notable one being with a man named James Joseph Armijo, who regularly mistreated her. Early in October of 2023, Rosa visited her mother, and they had a long discussion about the route that her life had taken. Arizona told her that she could go back to school since she was very intelligent, and they spoke about the possibility of Rosa starting a cleaning service. But 2 weeks later, Rosa disappeared. It isn't known whether she was reported as missing, since she was often out of contact with her family, but on the 17th of October that year, Arizona's worst fears were confirmed. Rosa was found deceased in a ditch along the 12900 block of Quebec Street in Thornton, Colorado. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade and her family was left devastated. Armijo and a few other suspects were questioned, but they could not be linked to the crime. Armijo would later be arrested and convicted for ending the life of his ex-girlfriend, Jacqueline, who'd been attacked with a blade. He was found to be in a delusional state, claiming that he was an FBI agent and that he was being followed by someone unknown. He was sent to prison for life. But for the next 22 years, Rosa's case went stagnant until it was reviewed in 2023, and a new suspect, Robert McLean, was identified, though the authorities have not revealed what tied him to the case. He'll be extradited to Colorado, where he will stand trial. Number 8. Keith Crutchfield, a 37-year-old man from Killeen in Texas, is just one of several people who've been taken into custody in connection with a cold case that dates back to June of 2007, and they'll now have to face lengthy prison sentences. It all started at around 11:45 p.m. on the 13th of June that year, when police officers in Meade Valley, California, heard that residents in the area heard the sound of firearms being discharged. They added that the noise seemed to be coming from a house on the 1900 block of Mariposa Avenue, where 51-year-old Andre Valdez was living. They suspected that a break-in was underway, and that it had probably gone wrong. When officers arrived at the address in question, they found several people who'd been assaulted and who'd suffered non-life-threatening injuries. But Andre wasn't as lucky. Despite the best efforts of first responders, he lost his life at the scene. Witnesses who saw what happened told investigators that they'd seen several men who were wearing masks over their faces, trying to gain entry into Andre's house. When they finally made it in, Andre confronted them, and an altercation broke out. One of the men then produced a firearm and fired at him, and as a result, he lost his life while trying to protect his property. The resulting investigation was conducted by the Riverside County Sheriff's Office Central Homicide Unit, but they had no luck in identifying the attackers, and with a lack of further leads, the case quickly went cold. For 18 years, no further clues were found, and since the culprits had hidden their faces behind masks, witnesses could not help identify them. It seemed as though they'd gotten away with their crime, but in February of 2025, it was decided that the case should be reviewed. A new group of investigators was assigned to the case, and before long, several suspects were identified, though it remains unclear whether new evidence was found or if someone close to the suspects decided to come forward. The 5 men, who are now in police custody, have been named as 37-year-old Keith Crutchfield, 37-year-old Kenneth Tucker, 36-year-old Deshaun Hill, 37-year-old Dennis Haynes, and 37-year-old Kenneth Haynes. Since this is an ongoing investigation, the authorities have declined to release any further information, but they've asked that anyone with further useful information come forward by contacting the Riverside Sheriff's Office Central Homicide Unit at 951-955-2777. Number 7. According to the family of 25-year-old Mary Schley, she was an extremely intelligent woman who was a gifted artist, equestrian, and scholar who loved to travel as often as she could. It's likely because of her love of travel that she was picked up while hitchhiking in Wisconsin in 1974, but it was a decision that cost her her life. Back in those days, it wasn't uncommon to see hitchhikers by the side of the road, since it was still relatively safe to get rides from strangers. Not many hitchhikers are seen these days, since many people have gone missing or lost their lives while out on the road. In February of that year, Mary was planning on attending an art show in Chicago, but she had no way of getting there. She was living in Minneapolis at the time, and the only solution she could come up with was to hitchhike there. On the 25th of February, her family got terrible news that Mary had been found deceased by the side of the road in Dunn County, Wisconsin. They were told that she'd been attacked with a sharp blade about 75 miles east of Minneapolis, but her attacker remained unidentified. The only piece of evidence that was found at the scene was a stocking cap with a few hairs attached to it, but since DNA technology was not being used to solve crimes, it failed to lead investigators to the culprit. Several people were interviewed after a few tips were received, but all of those people were ruled out as suspects, and Mary's case went cold. No motive could be found since she had not been robbed, making the crime even harder to solve. But her family remained hopeful that the person responsible would be tracked down one day. Nothing further was found for the next 51 years until 2025, when investigators decided to use DNA technology to move the case forward. The hairs that were found on the stocking cap were sent to a lab for testing, and they came back as a match for an 84-year-old man named John Miller. But finding Miller wasn't as easy as investigators first thought. When a familial connection was made, a man who was living in Wyoming directed them to his cousin, who resided in Wisconsin, but he was also ruled out as a suspect. Investigators then considered the possibility that Miller was adopted as a child, and hence the people who'd been interviewed may not have known of his existence. Another relative volunteered their DNA, and at last Miller was tracked down in Owatonna, Minnesota. He revealed that on that day, he was driving in his car when he spotted Mary hitchhiking by the side of the road. He decided to pick her up, but soon after she got in, he started making advances towards her. When she asked him to stop, he grabbed a blade that he had in the car with him and attacked her. After he ended her life, he pulled to the side of the highway and attempted to hide her body in a snowbank, but when another motorist drove by, he got scared and decided to flee, leaving her there to be found later. He also admitted that he dropped the cap that was found at the scene. Mary's family now finally has the answers that they've been waiting for over 50 years. Miller pleaded no contest at his trial, and he was sentenced to life in prison and was ordered to pay just $2,200 in restitution. Number 6. It's often the case that when a criminal is finally identified in an unsolved cold case, they're already in prison for a different crime that they committed. This tends to suggest that they attempted to make a career out of crime, only to end up behind bars. That's exactly what happened in the cold case involving a 57-year-old woman called Janet Abrills, who lost her life in a heinous attack in Lakeside Park, South Carolina in 2023. Janet was found deceased on Piedmont Highway on the 27th of August that year, and it was quickly determined that she'd been badly assaulted. At the time, investigators had very few leads to follow, and hence they asked for the public's help in identifying her attacker. But no such information was received, and for the next 2 years, very little could be done. But there was hope that the culprit would be tracked down via DNA evidence that was collected at the scene. And 2 years later, in 2025, investigators decided to revisit Janet's case in hopes that her attacker's DNA had been added to the national database. When the results came back from the laboratory, they revealed an exact match to a 49-year-old man named Robert Voorhees. Luckily, they didn't need to track him down since he was already incarcerated for 2 similar crimes that he'd committed before the attack on Janet. In 2004, Voorhees attacked April Dawkins, who since stated that she only barely managed to survive. But she did, and when Voorhees was identified as the one responsible, he was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. In an interview that she recently gave, she stated that she was certain she was about to lose her life. She was unable to move after Voorhees fled the scene, leaving her in some bushes next to Hilltop Road in Greenville. But she managed to cling to life, and for the next 11 hours, she hoped and prayed that someone would come along and find her so she could be brought to safety. When she was eventually found, she was treated at a nearby hospital, and she told the police that Voorhees had assaulted her with the butt of a firearm before dragging her by her hair. She now needs hearing aids to hear, and she had to have metal implants added to her skull due to fractures caused by the attack. In 2025, he was charged with yet another assault on a woman who was left in critical condition. Luckily, it's very likely that he'll remain behind bars for many years to come, and that he'll never have the chance to commit such a heinous crime ever again. Number 5. DNA technology was used in 2025 to finally apprehend the man who ended the life of 24-year-old Samantha Mizzi in St Kilda in Melbourne, Australia, in 1994, and the Victoria Police have stated that they are elated to have finally found some answers in this case. The incident occurred on the 29th of March that year. A member of the public was walking along the back of a property on Brighton Road at around 11 p.m. when they spotted something strange in the bushes that line that road. Upon closer inspection, they realized that it was a woman who was badly injured, and according to some sources, some of her belongings were stolen. They contacted the police, after which Victoria was found unresponsive but still alive, and she was rushed to a local hospital where she received treatment. But her injuries were too severe, and she passed away the next day. It was then confirmed that Victoria hailed from Castlemaine and that she traveled to St Kilda a day earlier, leaving her children in the care of a friend. Her plan was to find some money to take care of the children, though it isn't known how she planned on earning it. No one had witnessed the attack, and no one came forward with any information in the 3 decades that passed while Victoria's case grew colder by the day. But investigators never forgot about her, and they remained committed to finding the person who ended her life, so that they could be brought to justice. Several appeals were made to the public to come forward with information, but to no avail. Then in 2025, DNA that was found at the crime scene finally led the police to a 67-year-old man named Colin George McCain, and he was taken into custody. At his hearing, Victoria's son and daughter were in attendance, and they stated that they were relieved to finally know who ended their mother's life, but added that they would need some time to process the progress that's now been made in her case. They've come to realize that no one is safe from this type of crime, but find it a great comfort that an attacker can be identified and brought to justice decades after the crime was committed. Number 4. It must be a living nightmare to be convicted of a serious crime when you know that you're innocent, especially if it means that you'll be spending the rest of your life in prison. This is what happened to Chad Haynes after he was arrested for ending the life of his sister-in-law, Tina, in 1994. At the time, Chad was 19 years old, and he just moved back to Jacksonville, Florida. His fiancée was supposed to join him there in a few days, and while waiting for her, he stayed with Tina and slept on her couch. Then, on the night of the 17th of April, 1994, something truly strange happened. Chad returned to the house at around 12:30 a.m. after a night out, and he fell asleep on the couch. Tina arrived about 2 hours later, unbeknownst to him, and she went straight to bed. When Chad woke up the next morning at around 5:45, he was shocked to realize that the kitchen and living room were on fire. The couch that he was sleeping on had also started to burn, but he managed to douse all of the flames. He deactivated the smoke alarm and went to check on Tina, and that's when he made a startling discovery. She was deceased in her room, having been attacked with a sharpened blade, and he immediately called the police. The crime scene was processed, and a few hairs were collected. When they were tested, they were found to not belong to Chad. He was questioned. His fingernails and clothes were checked for evidence, and it was noted that he had no scratch marks or bruises on his body. This would lead any reasonable person to believe that he was innocent, but the police felt otherwise, and he was arrested and charged with ending Tina's life. At his trial, it was revealed that he suffered from a sleep disorder that made it difficult to wake him up, and it was noted that he'd been drinking that night. The prosecution argued that he'd ended Tina's life out of jealousy, and his case took a further hit when 2 inmates came forward to report that Chad had confessed to them that he was the attacker. In September of 1996, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He maintained his innocence, but his pleas fell on deaf ears, and his subsequent appeals were unsuccessful. Years later, in 2001, he contacted the Innocence Project in hopes that the truth would come out. They asked that skin samples from under Tina's nails be sent for DNA testing, and the request was granted. The results showed that the samples did not match Chad's DNA, and they then asked that the hairs found at the scene be compared to the skin cells. This was done in 2005, and it came to light that the skin and hair belonged to the same unknown male. It was only then that it was revealed that a fingerprint was found on Tina's bathroom sink, and it was assumed that her attacker had tried to wash his hands before fleeing. This print also didn't match Chad's. This was never disclosed at his trial, for reasons unknown, and in 2006, his conviction was vacated. A retrial was scheduled, but before it could be held, it was announced that further DNA testing had been done, and Chad could not have been the attacker. He was set free in 2007 after 13 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. In 2025, investigators finally had a break in the case. The DNA that had been uploaded into the national database came back as a match for a former sailor named Michael Ziegler, who was stationed at the Naval Station Mayport at the time of the crime, and he was a friend of Tina's husband. Ziegler was arrested decades after the fact in Covington, Georgia, and he was taken to Duval County Jail, where he awaits his trial with no bond set. Number 3. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, the cold case involving 57-year-old Garnet Elizabeth Griffith has finally been solved, and her attacker will now face the consequences of the crimes that he's committed. At the time that she lost her life in 1989, Garnet was working as a librarian in Washington, D.C., specifically at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. But on the 11th of December that year, she failed to show up for her shift, and one of her friends noted this. They went to Garnet's house on Kensington Way to check on her, but upon entering the house at around 10:30 a.m., they came across a distressing scene. Garnet was lying on the floor, and she was no longer alive. Her friend called the police, who assessed the scene and decided she'd lost her life in a tragic accident. It seemed as though she'd tripped on the stairs and fallen, hitting her head on a nearby table and losing her life in the process. This was found not to be the case, though, when an autopsy was later performed. It was discovered she'd been attacked with a firearm, and that the injuries she sustained to her head weren't visible at the crime scene. But this did little to move the case forward, as investigators were left baffled by one particular detail. They'd searched the entire house and found no signs of forced entry, which suggested she either knew her attacker or opened the door for them. Her neighbors were questioned, but they were unable to provide any further details. They hadn't seen any suspicious activity that night and didn't hear any sounds of a struggle taking place. But they did state that Garnet had been living in her house for about 2 years, and they described her as an independent yet reserved person who'd never caused them any issues. No new clues were found, and before long, the case went cold. Over the next 30 years, it was revisited from time to time, but no progress was made. Then, in 2025, new evidence and a combined effort by state and local authorities led to the men who ended Garnet's life, though it remains unclear at this point what that new evidence was. What is known is that William Cook Jr. was arrested at his house at 29 West Washington Street in Annapolis, and he's been charged with ending Garnet's life. It was later discovered that she knew Cook from when he was a teenager, as he used to mow her lawn, which suggests that he planned the crime well in advance. It was during the same time that he ended Garnet's life, and for 36 years, he remained free while investigators tried to identify him. Garnet's family has thanked the police for finally providing them with a sense of closure, and for never giving up on her case. The case against Cook is now being prepared, and it's expected that he'll face a lengthy prison sentence. The motive for the crime has not been made public, but the court will hear that it was a brutal attack, during which Garnet was not only beaten but also attacked with a firearm. Number 2. The case involving 26-year-old Valerie Laguna, who lost her life in an attack, started on the 19th of July, 2005. This was the day that she was last seen by her friends and family in San Antonio, Texas, and they could not have expected what happened next. Later that same day, Valerie was found deceased in the Cristo Rey Cemetery in Cotulla, Texas, and when an autopsy was performed, it revealed that she'd been assaulted before her attacker ended her life via strangulation. But it was the assault that led to her passing, and the police asked for witnesses to come forward. A few people were interviewed and DNA was collected from the scene, but no further information could be found. And eventually a $6,000 reward was offered to anybody who provided investigators with information leading to Valerie's attacker's identity. But this failed to drum up any new leads, and her case went cold. The case was investigated by the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office in collaboration with the Texas Rangers, Williamson County Sheriff's Office, DPS Crime Laboratory, and the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. And at one point, a suspect was identified. A man named Saul Gonzalez was questioned, and it could not be proven that he was the attacker. And for the next 15 years, nothing more was found. Then, in 2020, the case was reviewed once again, and the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office decided to send several pieces of evidence that had been preserved to a DNA testing company. DNA attached to those items provided investigators with a profile of the culprit, and in 2021, the Texas Rangers decided to have further testing done on those items, and new evidence that had been uncovered. But it would only be in 2023 that the results identified 66-year-old Gonzalez as being present at the crime scene. And in 2025, he was finally tracked down and arrested. He was charged with capital murder and taken to the LaSalle County Jail, where he awaited trial. Number 1. While an arrest has been made in the cold case of 24-year-old Donna Ogilvie, the police have urged anyone with further information on her case to come forward so that witness statements and as much evidence as possible can be collected. Donna had moved to Toronto, Canada from the Philippines in November of 1997 in hopes of turning over a new leaf, but it seems that her new beginning didn't get off to the start that she had hoped for. Before long, she started working as a street worker to make ends meet, and this likely ended up costing her life. Then, on the morning of the 8th of March 1998, Donna was found deceased in a parking lot in Toronto, and it was determined she'd been attacked and strangled. She'd only been in Toronto for 5 weeks before her life was ended. DNA was found to be present at the scene, and it was collected, and it was sent to be analyzed, and a profile was developed, but no one in the national database came back as a match. The case went cold, and it was feared that Donna's attacker would get away with their crime. At one point, a YouTube video was published in which investigators asked for anyone with helpful information on her case to contact them, but it was all to no avail. Another appeal was made on the Toronto Police Service's podcast, which they call 24 Shades of Blue, but no further tips were received. Since Donna was new to the area, she likely hadn't had a chance to make many friends, and hence her movements that day remained a mystery. But investigators refused to give up on the case, and in 2022, the collected DNA was sent to a group of genealogists, and they traced it to the family of 50-year-old Ronald Ackerman. It was discovered that at the time of the attack, he was working as a truck driver, and that he was living in Scarborough, which is only a short distance away from the crime scene, but he could not be immediately arrested, as he was working at oil sands for 2 weeks. But when it came to light that he was planning on flying home to Newfoundland, a plan was formulated, and when he landed at Pearson International Airport, he was confronted and taken into custody. It's believed that Ackerman was one of Donna's clients that night, since the area where she was found was known to be frequented by street workers, but it remains unknown whether they'd met before, or whether he was known to the other street workers in the area. It became a popular spot for this type of activity, since it was not covered by security cameras, and hence Ackerman knew that he would not be easily identified, but he failed to take into account that his DNA would be discovered at the scene. After his arrest, it was revealed that Ackerman was known to the authorities, though they've declined to state how he appeared on their radar. He was never considered a suspect in Donna's case until his DNA came back as a match. He's now been charged with first-degree murder, and the investigation continues, since there is a possibility that he may have attacked other women while he was working as a truck driver decades ago. Anyone who can provide further helpful details in Donna's case, or about Ackerman's life before his arrest, is urged to contact the police at 416-808-7400, or submit a tip via Crime Stoppers. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.